Thank you everyone for joining in today. Our agenda for the discussion or the topic of discussion for today is data protection through the eyes of IT department. What we plan on doing here is we intend to touch upon certain topics that are related to data protection, but how does it affect the IT department and what can IT professionals do to understand how data protection is a part of their daily operations as well as their best practices to make sure that given that IT team is mostly responsible for making sure that user experience and user functionalities are there. But addition to that, on a layer above that, what can IT professionals do to make sure that data protection is also something they actively look for while they implement different IT solutions? So we have Reena today. Reena is a general manager at IT InfoSec, and there's of course me, Krishna. So I'll just give a quick introduction about myself, and then I'll pass over the baton to Reena to talk about herself a bit. So I have been a co-founder here at Tsaaro. I am the director for cybersecurity, and I look after the security consulting practice or the data protection consulting practice at Tsaaro. So we deal with a lot of different clients globally. It could be clients in Europe, clients in India, which is why we are also very well equipped with the data privacy aspect, which is GDPR. And I'll just pass it over to Reena now. Reena, if you could just give a quick introduction about yourself to the participants.
Sure. Thank you, Krishna, and good morning to all. I'm Reena Vengeri. I have about 30 plus years of service delivery experience in various domains. I have worked with Wipro, ITC Infotech, ITC agribusinesses in the past, and also have US and Canada experience where I was into delivery roles at the customer facing side. Over the last 4 years, I have moved to the data protection area. In my current organization, we had set up the DPO office, so I did a training and certification, and I'm responsible for compliance on data protection at the organization. Happy to be part of this discussion and would like to share my experiences as well. If you look at 10 years back, I think cybersecurity was the buzzword. It has kind of come to a steady state now, and privacy has taken over the last 2-3 years. That is the area where people are building their own, careers, and it's a very interesting subject to know and not very complex. So it's the nuances which are important to understand from a concepts perspective. So switching your careers or even starting careers in data privacy and protection is a very good idea. Thank you, Krishna.
Thank you, Reena. So the way we will conduct this session is because we want to make sure that there is a lot of Q&A that goes on. So if you have any questions at any point during the presentation or during our discussion, feel free to drop it in the chat section and we'll take it up from our end. Or in the end of the session, we have a other Q&A session where you can simply just pose your questions. But in case you feel that urge to ask the question in between, just feel free to do it because we are happy to take it up. So I'll just quickly speak about Tsaaro if you have not been a part of our other webinars. So Tsaaro is a cybersecurity and a data privacy consulting firm. We provide services across the globe to majorly market in the European, India, Middle East, and the Malaysian market. And of course, this is what we do. We do a lot of security consulting activities such as penetration testing, managed services, etc. Then in data privacy, we do laws related to GDPR, CCPA, LGBT, right? So those are some of the specific activities that we do as a company. Now, just a simple disclaimer for everyone as well, that the discussion points here for today's session is not something that should be taken as a legal advice, right? This is just a discussion to make sure that there is some kind of educational awareness. And of course, it is only to make sure that our opinions or our statements are something that is also understood by our participants here as well. No legal advice from our end. That is just a simple disclaimer in a few words. Right, so coming to the agenda of the discussion, we will discuss the 6 different points that we mentioned here. We will start with how data protection came in, right? What is the major difference between data protection, security, and privacy? Because these days, these terms are used a lot and there is a difference between them, but people don't really take it seriously. They feel that data protection and data privacy are the same things. But they are actually not, which we will discuss in the next few minutes. Then the key areas of concern for data protection in an IT ecosystem, right? What IT professionals or IT managers can do to make sure that data protection is something that they can inculcate in their daily operations. Then, of course, we will also talk about how to respond to different data breaches. And at the end of this session, we also want to make sure that there is some kind of takeaway for all the participants that come in. So we have curated a checklist, a GDPR checklist for data protection, specifically for the IT department. So at the end of the session, we'll just share that checklist with you, and you can take it away as one of the key takeaways from this agenda, from this deck, right? Also, we will discuss about the data protection best practices. Right, so I'll just pass it over to you, Reena. According to you, or in your personal opinion, what do you think is data protection?
Okay, so if you look at data protection is the how of data privacy. How do you protect data? How do you deal with data, right from building access privileges, right from taking backups and the IT aspects from a process standpoint. The how of data privacy is addressed by data protection. So if you look at access privileges, the access of personal data in an organization needs to be controlled. That means the need to know basis of providing access has to be established and given only to individuals who are supposed to have access. That is one part. Similarly, if you look at, there are a lot of expectations. If you look at from a regulatory standpoint, the expectation is if you have personal data collected for your organization, it is important that you have a process of ensuring that that data is kept safe, secure, and not corrupted or passed on to unrequired people. So those are the aspects from a data protection standpoint which I come out with.
Right. So, Reena, so I was having a discussion with one of our clients, and they're a new age startup, right? So these startups don't really feel the need for data protection or don't really understand because there is a lack of awareness, and especially because they don't have a dedicated IT team. So when I was talking to the startup, they mentioned that they usually talk to their HR team to add users to their, of course, their productivity suite, which could be Google or Microsoft, right, as commonly seen in the industry. And apart from that, they did not have any data protection practice at all. So they just felt it is enough for them to just add users and provide licenses to them. And then Google and Microsoft would automatically take care of the security, given that they have corporate laptops everywhere. So what do you think startups can, do to better create that awareness around data protection?
So from an awareness standpoint, I think it is important to sensitize, even if they are startup teams and small players in the market, in terms of what is the sensitivity of handling personal data. Though they have given the responsibility to HR to provide accesses and manage the accesses privileges, it is important for us to understand as to what are we talking about in terms of these practices. So though these small players will have installations or instances of Microsoft or Google used for those practices, these are facilitators for doing business. At the end of the day, the accountability is with the organization to ensure that what data is being collected, processed within their organization is securely done as a work practice. Whether you borrow the secure work practices from such vendors is a different aspect, but that's a strategy you need to develop at the org level as to how will you ensure protection of personal data for the organization.
Right. So I think it is equally important for the top management to understand what kind of security and data privacy needs or requirements are there for their industry. Right? So I usually see that top management is not very well aware around the data protection requirements or the data protection compliance requirements. They just feel that if you plug in an antivirus solution, all your problems are solved. But that is, of course, how not it works, right? Because recently there have been talks about the zero trust architecture as well, where you have to authenticate a user at every step. And if you look back at these startups, then they are completely opposite to the cybersecurity frameworks that are coming up. So that is just one point I wanted to highlight as well. Because if you look at the different startups that are coming up, they mostly focus on their product, which is, of course, it makes business sense to focus on your product. But then, of course, if you feel that compliance is expensive, there's a very famous quote that goes around it: try non-compliance, right? Because the reputation loss that could happen to your organization in case of any non-compliance is huge, and it is not something that is easily measurable as well.
Yeah, so if you look at this privacy and the evolution of cybersecurity, it is always top down driven. Okay, meaning from a management standpoint, looking at what business you are doing, what is the industry in which you are playing, it is important to understand and amalgamate the requirements of regulatory in terms of privacy and even cybersecurity. So all of this implementation has to be approached top down from a organization perspective.
Definitely. Because even if people in the company understand that there are some security solutions needed, there is a budget approval that comes from the top management. For that, you need to present your business case, because in the end, it's a business decision that needs to be made for your organization,
Yes.
right? So I think we have mostly covered about different data protection aspects and how it is equally important for a startup or a matured organization. Now, I think we'll move on to the next part where we'll talk about the need for data protection in IT and what IT team can do to make sure that these data protection practices are something they can easily integrate with their daily operations. So what are your views on this, Reena?
Yeah, so if you look at evolution of businesses, now we are in a digital age. We earlier small businesses used to operate manually, where they used to keep the data in registers manually written, and then those registers used to be kept in lock and key. That was a data protection mechanism at that point in time. Now, as technology and tools have evolved, it is important for organizations to consider available solutions which have security embedded in them. So there are a lot of these business processes integrated with IT processes and workflows which are provided by third parties. It is important for organizations to evaluate these solutions and ensure that they are imbibing the best practices from the industry so that their productivity as a business also improves, right?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. So I think one of the first points where an IT team should start is to make sure that every system or every corporate endpoint in your internal infrastructure is something that you can easily identify, right? Because that is a huge challenge that is posed in larger organizations when you don't have the correct track of the number of systems you have in your infrastructure, because that could mean a potential breach or a potential entry for a malicious actor in your environment. So for starters, your hardware asset register or your asset inventory is a very crucial step to identify the different endpoints, because that is where you can actually start protecting those endpoints as well. Because if you can't identify, then you can't protect, right? So obviously, having these modern tools such as something as simple as your Excel online, it really helps to maintain an asset register. You don't need a very fancy tool for an asset inventory, especially for small or medium organizations or enterprises. You can simply use an Excel sheet to track it. And since it would be a live Excel sheet, it would also be a collaborative effort from different sections of your startup or your organization as well. For example, your HR team could also add in details, your IT team could also add in details, and then someone could verify those details as well. So security is not simply about implementing solutions and kind of plugging those solutions in your infrastructure. You need to also identify what is the best business case for you and what are the best options already that are available for you as well.
Yeah, so if you look at asset management being one aspect which you covered, taking this forward, the other things which will have to be done is how is the access control or a security to data which is established at these security practices. That is one. Second would be that whether the data which is getting collected and processed is backed up and made available securely to the users on a need basis, right? And then the other aspect also would be that while these IT users would be accessing systems from the organization, it is important for them to be aware of how to deal with sensitive data, what is required from a protection perspective. And anyway, the central best practices of the organizations would make sure that the security practices related to prevention of fraudulent activities or hacking and so on is already implemented. But at the grassroots level, at the employee level, it is important to build the awareness on data protection practices.
I agree with that. So since you also mentioned about building awareness, I think one of the other parts that I want to discuss is from a real world example that we had with one of our previous clients. So one of our previous clients had AnyDesk installed on more than 60 to 70 systems of their corporate endpoints. And this AnyDesk version was the vulnerable version, right? It was not the most recently patched application. And if people here are not aware, AnyDesk is an application with which you can get a remote access of the system. You just need to type in a code and you get remote access of a system. Especially if you are using a vulnerable version, the user need not, even approve that request as well. You can make sure that you just get that PIN code, you type it in, and you get access to that system. So something as simple as vulnerability management, or at least managing the software inventory as well. So we have spoken mostly about asset management related to hardwares, but something that's equally important is the software asset inventory. Because as an organization, you need to make sure that there are a set of applications that you approve, and there are a different bunch of applications that you can prohibit or reject for users to install in their corporate endpoints. So that is where the software inventory also comes in, and it's equally important.
Yeah, one more point on software would be that if you look at all of these new players or the startups which are coming in, there's a lot of reusable code available on the net, on various URLs, websites and all, right?
Yep.
So as a matter of practice, it is important to educate the users on secure practices while using reusable code. And then also using these public sites where you are actually using the facility of testing or evaluating the code which you have developed. And you should make sure that there is no personal data which is by mistake put on public sites. That is very key when you are actually evolving the IT practices in an organization.
I completely agree with that, Reena. So the concepts of anonymization is something that you should probably explore, because if you are developing a program and if you're using personal data as test data, and if you're based in a country where a data privacy law is active, then you should rethink that approach, because ideally test data should not be related to an actual personal data, either anonymize it or use data that is not related to a personally identifiable individual, right? So that is, of course, one of the more important things that we want to discuss. And also, if you are a developer or someone from the IT team and you're testing your product or your source code on a website, you also have to make sure that the website does not store that data as well. Because first, your intellectual property is lost because you're uploading some kind of source code that is specific to your organization. Second, you're uploading personal data. So it is a direct GDPR violation as well. You're uploading it to a third party without any consent taken from the user. And of course, they would probably keep that data. They would keep the logs for that data as well. And there is no way for you to ask for deletion. Right?
And that is where I think the IT practices of the organization will come into play, where access restrictions to specific websites, whitelisting of IPs, all of these aspects are part of a very integral part of an organization who is into IT services.
Definitely. I completely agree with that, Reena, because in larger organizations, we usually see that there is a SOC or there is a threat prevention center, a dedicated security center. But for smaller organizations, something as simple as blocking adult content or blocking hacking sites is something that you can take as an easy step to at least prevent some of the attackers to come into your infrastructure. So what you are essentially doing is you are reducing your attack surface area. So the hacker has fewer entry points to get into your infrastructure. So the likelihood of a breach also reduces. Right. So we always want to make our webinars or our sessions interactive, which is why we have Menti here. Right. So we just wanted your understanding and your opinions on whether data privacy and data protection are the same thing. So to do that, just go to menti.com, right? Just type in your browser menti.com and use this code 89751769 and just share your responses with us. We just want to understand from a participant's perspective, what are your opinions about the similarities or maybe the differences between data privacy and data protection. Right. So I think, Reena, we have a fairly educated crowd around data protection and data privacy. That's good to see. Or maybe I think we were wrong to maybe discuss about data protection and data privacy in the beginning of our conversation. That probably gave them some hint around if they are same or not.
Yeah, I mean, right, we assume that there'll be a mixed crowd.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty good response, that around 60 people understand that data privacy and data protection are not the same thing, right? So that is really good to see that the awareness that our participants have around this topic is immense, right? So Reena, let's just focus a bit more over the differences between data privacy and data protection. So if you could just highlight a few points that a user can take back.
Yeah. So data privacy is about, giving the fair privilege to a user when they are sharing their personal data. That's privacy. That means you're giving them the respect of having their data shared with the organization. Or it's about how comfortable you are to share your data with an organization. That is data privacy. The data protection, as I said, would be the aspects which are considered in terms of methods implemented to secure data. That is the primary understanding, I think, in a simple one line.
Yeah, I think that's a very good explanation, Reena. I mean, the first part when you discuss about data privacy being, kind of a right that you have to give to the user, because you're also appreciating the fact that the user is sharing some kind of personal information with you. They're confiding some kind of personal data, and you have to respect that as well. So providing that respect is basically or essentially the element to data privacy. Perfect. Right. So this is something that we have already covered, Reena. We spoke about data privacy, data security, and data protection. So we'll just skip over this slide because we've discussed this a lot. But then again, I'll just want to focus on a few minute details here, right? Because data privacy, like Reena just mentioned, it is about controlling access to the information a user is providing to you. So the organization that is collecting the data must determine the kind of processing activities that would take place on the data. And by processing activities, we don't necessarily mean that you have to use that data for maybe analytics purpose, or maybe sending out emails, or maybe sending out sales emails. Even if you're just collecting data, that's also categorizes under processing, because you need to have an interest, or you need to have a good reason why you are collecting that data. Because in GDPR terms, there needs to be some legal interest, legitimate interest, or any similar kind of interest while you're collecting that data.
And also to add there, Krishna, the aspects from an organization standpoint on data privacy would be that you need to demonstrate the intent that you are taking care of the sensitivities of personal data of individuals, right? That is one part. And then maintaining the integrity of that data. And also ensuring that when data is lost or leaked, how are you actually retrieving it, and providing the assessment of what harm has happened to that data of that individual. So these aspects cover the gamut of privacy. Now, the measures which are taken by organizations will come under these two buckets of data security and data protection.
Agreed, Reena. So if you also look at GDPR, and if you see companies that are saying that they are GDPR compliant, right, that word or that certification does not exist, right? Because that is what they're trying to actually say is that they can demonstrate compliance in case a supervisory authority reaches out to them for any of the GDPR related issues. So essentially, that is what they mean. So if you look at any website, I've seen a lot of startups and organizations recently coming up, and there's a badge on their website that says that they're GDPR compliant. So first of all, I was very confused because being in this field, I had no idea that a certification like that exists. So I went back and researched about it. Then I understood that this is the thought that organizations have when they put that badge over their websites.
Yeah.
Right. So some of the key areas of concern for data protection here, this is very broad, right? We have tried to cover websites, we have tried to cover software applications, and we have also tried to cover best practices as an IT admin as well. So, Reena, would you like to take up software updates and speak about how the key area of concern software update is related to data protection?
Yeah. So if you look at software update, it's about those packages which are available to organizations, which are being installed at endpoints, at end users' laptops, where, say for example, prevention of sending personal data or organization specific confidential data outside the organization. Okay, so there are a lot of these softwares available which prevent that. Now, if the vendor who's provided that particular package has rolled out certain patches, it is important for organizations to take them and then implement it at all endpoints. There could be, if the software updates are not done periodically, there could be situations where there is malicious code coming in, or there is a vulnerability in the infrastructure which has been creeping in. So that is about software updates, and it is important to stay up to date in all our endpoints. From an awareness standpoint, each of our employees need to ensure that they have the latest patches as rolled out by the IT department.
Definitely. So just one more point I wanted to cover here, because this is personally a situation that I've personally faced during implementation of certain solutions. So if you look at your corporate infrastructure, you would have Windows devices, you would have Mac devices, you would also have some of the Linux devices. Maybe you have Ubuntu installed, or maybe any other Linux OS, right? So if you're looking for a solution that takes care of software updates or makes sure that your applications on your system are updated, you have to make sure that you can cover all these different type of operating systems that are used in your infrastructure. And there is a common myth, Reena, as well, that Mac systems are by default protected, that you don't need an antivirus solution on a Mac system because it's more secure. So
Yeah.
what is your take on that?
I have not really worked on Mac systems, but my understanding is that the maturity of Mac systems would be way ahead from compared to, because their evolution has been over a period of time, and even their baking of the security practices in their design itself has been considered, in my understanding. And but it's a evolution, right? Software updates and upgrades to different packages, in even irrespective of Mac or Android or anything, it is always a mandatory requirement to ensure that your software is updated to the latest patch. So though Mac may be considered as a, advanced mature infrastructure, and however I think software updates is integral to any type of IT.
Exactly. So adding on to that, if you also look at the number of systems that are available in the world, that when Bill Gates had the idea of pushing out Microsoft, his idea was to make sure that there is a Windows in every home across the world, right? So the number of Windows devices are much more than the number of Mac devices that are being used on a daily basis. And from a cybersecurity or a hack perspective, you might have also heard about the different iCloud services that have been hacked for celebrities, right? So it is not that if you have, or if you use a certain solution, you are protected. What matters from an IT perspective is the configuration you make on that device, because any device that is connected to the internet or not connected to the internet can be hacked, right? Because in the end, it's a flaw that you have not yet identified, or it's a flaw that is already existing in the wild. So you have to make sure that the flaws that are already existing in the wild are taken care by the software updates that you can push out as an IT admin. Right. So
Similarly, I think on the firewall, software upgrades, it is very important, but because that is one of the critical gateways for IT, for
right,
any
right.
organization. Yeah.
Right. So mostly firewall updates or high availability in firewalls is something IT people mostly look over, right? Because high availability for a firewall is equally important. You can't just have one firewall that is doing all the different restriction for your infrastructure. You need to make sure there is a backup firewall in case the main firewall does not work out, or there is an issue with it, or there is a OS issue, right? Anything could happen. When you look at IT, anything could happen. So if you have a critical system or a gateway such as a firewall, you need to have a backup for it, or at least have the configuration backed up somewhere so that you can spin up a new firewall. So those are some IT concerns that you need to take care of.
And mostly these data breaches and all, this main gateway is firewall. So,
exactly.
Most of these breaches go through that. And that is where the key is in terms of building a security layer properly there.
Exactly. So, Reena, these new next generation firewalls, they have additional capabilities. They work as routers, they work as switches, they work as basically an end-to-end device. And this one device is responsible for everything. So it makes it more critical to make sure that your security practices on that particular device is up to the standard.
Yes.
Right. So I'll just quickly speak about SQL injection as well. This is mostly something that is related to web application attacks, right? If you have a web application and there's a SQL code someone can inject using a form or using a form field, then a SQL injection vulnerability is something that can happen, because if you put in a code that goes to a database server and the database server elicits that response or shares that response with you, then of course it is something that is known as SQL injection, because you basically injected a SQL code, you got that database server to respond to that SQL code, and you got that data, which is not something that you should see. So these SQL injection attacks are easily preventable. You need to make sure that the type of inputs that are provided in any form field on a web application are something that is checked by the server at the backend. So these simple checks are something that an IT admin should do. Even if it's your intranet portal, you still have to make sure that SQL injection attacks are not something that can be done on your intranet portals as well. Because developers these days, they are of course bright, they understand how systems work, right? So it is very easy for them to write a crafted SQL injection code into the form field, and they can get some confidential data, which might not want them to have. And something that I also see, Reena, happening in the IT environment is that there are a lot of unlicensed products that are being
Yes.
used in the developer ecosystem. So
Yes.
how do you think IT admins can tackle that?
So see, what can be done is that periodic review and audits of endpoints to see that the software which is installed in endpoints is all authorized and as per the software inventory list which is there at the org level. And then, respective actions from a disciplinary standpoint, if there is a vulnerability which is very high from loss of personal data, those measures need to be put in place and sensitized to these developer community about what is the repercussion of violating any of those practices. And similarly, if you look at the developer community needs to have a code of practice which they need to follow from a development perspective. So application security aspects, database security aspects, all of those have to be completely followed, and there has to be a mechanism of checking that these are not being violated.
Right. So I agree with that. I mean, even if developers follow a standard process, they do not document it, right? There is no documentation of the SDLC process they follow, even if the process is up to the standard industry-wide recognized standards, but they don't document it usually. So this is something that developers, or at least the senior managers or IT admins, should take care of, that you need to document the processes that you're doing. Because in an event where a new developer comes in and they would have their own expertise, their own way of working, but if that SDLC process is available, it is easy for them to replicate it and make sure that your infrastructure remains protected. Right. So there are 6 different key areas of concern that we had here. Something that I also want to discuss is configuration of SSL and TLS. These are basically your certificate protocols for using websites. And if you are aware, TLS version 1.0 is something that has been replaced with the latest versions 1.2. And 2 also is also coming up, 3 version is also coming up. So, right. So make sure you update those protocols with the latest versions, understand the vulnerability that was present in the previous version and remediate it as well. Because during the bunch of VAPT tests that we have done these days, we identified that TLS version 1.0 is still enabled by default. And the vulnerabilities there means that any traffic coming to your website would remain unencrypted, which means that if an admin logs into an admin panel or an admin portal on your website, those credentials could be harvested by a malicious actor. So those are some of the repercussions for not having a data protection program or not actively looking out for security.
And as a practice, I think WAPT and VAPT should be done periodically to identify at least those strategic applications in the organization which have exposure to such risks from a personal data perspective, and ensure that those vulnerabilities are identified and remediated. Yeah, there has to be a periodic check. And that's why I think from what I have experienced is that the business and IT have to work very, very closely. They need to ensure that the priorities are aligned, and these periodic steps are taken in the organization to ensure that we do not get caught in the middle of a issue.
Definitely. So, of course, it's a cohesive activity that needs to be done, right? One IT team or one security team might not be able to pull all strings and do all the security related work. There needs to be a buy-in from the business stakeholders as well. There needs to be some kind of push from the business stakeholders as well, which is also something that we suggest to larger organizations when they have a privacy program, that they need to have privacy champions from each business unit. Because these people would be the ones who would understand the business better than the privacy team, and they would also be able to provide more insights and inputs into your entire journey of data protection.
Yes.
Right. So, right, I'll move on to the next part. We'll use Menti again quickly. I just want your opinions on understanding if your organization incorporates the PPD or privacy by design into their IT systems. So for people who are not aware, Reena, would you just quickly try and tell them about privacy by design?
Yeah, so privacy by design is a concept in the privacy domain, and it has evolved over a period of time. If you look at the concept has been there for a while now. If you look at what it means is that any application or any business process which you are formulating or beginning to adopt, the design aspects of that need to have privacy considered at the inception stage of that process or the application or the IT system, which means that if you are dealing with personal data in an application, you need to identify what aspects of that personal data need to be considered from a security perspective. Privacy by design primarily talks about how are you securing the data from the inception stage, right? So in an application, if you are having personal data elements in a particular table, what secure measures have you implemented at the database level from access privilege perspective, or anonymization of data perspective, or ensuring that a work practice which says that the test environment would not have personal data from production? Is there a process like that? So right from taking steps technically from IT standpoint to a business process to a workflow which is actually controlling aspects of security is what privacy of by design talks about.
I think that was the probably one of the best explanation for privacy by design I've heard in a while. So thank you for that, Reena. And it's very good to see that most of our participants here are from a very mature organization in terms of privacy, because they have privacy by design embedded into their IT systems, which is a rare happenstance because I don't usually see it happening anywhere. Because the concept itself is pretty new, especially in the Indian market itself, because in the Indian market is still at that stage where data privacy is becoming a hot topic in the industry. But to understand privacy by design fully, or to make sure that it is embedded everywhere into your business processes, it is a longer journey than one might think. Right? It is not simply a solution that you can implement or integrate with your existing ecosystem. It is a journey in terms of awareness, in terms of creating those principles, those checklists, making sure they are monitored as well. So it is I see it as a 6 to 8 month journey for an organization that has around 300 to 400 people, because of course you also have people who are doing their daily operations, and to inculcate a new philosophy or a new way of working is something that would also irk some users as well. So you have to make them understand first why it is important, then you have to slowly integrate those practices into the IT system or for your users as well.
Yeah, and also it is important for even small organizations or startups, if they are buying solutions in the IT area, to have a check if there is a access to personal data by that particular application or a solution, and ensuring that the change management process, when you are doing enhancements to that application, whether the aspects of privacy by design are considered in the architecture of that system or the solution. So that is where you need to put a check even for identified applications which are available to use by organizations to enhance the business productivity. So the privacy by design is a very, very basic concept, and it is a very important aspect in the privacy world. This has been a very close to heart kind of concept for me also. I've written some article and as well as humor on this, so I can share that off.
That explains the explanation you gave, why it was so concise and why it made so much sense to me as well. Perfect, Reena. So, Reena, we also have a question from one of our participants. Venkat wants to know, what are the current challenges to educate employees on privacy concepts or privacy by design, and what measures can be taken to counter this awareness problem?
Yeah, very interesting. Actually, this is a very common question and a challenge faced by a lot of organizations. So if you look at awareness building is a journey. So if you look at when any organization would have started adopting practices to comply to requirements of GDPR way back in 2018, the approach would have been, okay, what is GDPR? Let us educate our ground level employees, irrespective of whether they are dealing with personal data or not. So in a typical IT services scenario, you will have a lot of projects which are being run, right? Some of these projects would have access to personal data. Some of these projects would have access to business processes at the customer level. It is important to have a uniform awareness built over a period of time in terms of what are the sensitivities of handling personal data? What are the definitions? How do we deal with personal data in terms of doing privacy impact assessments, right? And these programs need to be periodically updated based on the regulatory updates which are coming into play. That is one part. Second part is it has to be a repetitive exercise within the organization to refresh the knowledge of privacy within the individuals, right? Then the other thing also could be that there's a lot of awareness building exercises which are done by creating banners, doing some small snippets where it is demonstrated what is privacy. And then on a rotation basis, departments can identify their privacy leads and ensure that this is championed at the small group level within the organization. It's a evolving practice. It's never, we can never say that we are 100% culturally aware of privacy. It's an evolving thing here. So that is what I would think. This is how we can manage it.
Definitely. I completely agree with that, Reena. I also wanted to add a point on how can users, kind of add on these different privacy related awareness trainings. So if you're a larger organization and if you have a learning management system, then something you can do is simply add some privacy modules and make it mandatory for each employee to complete. Right. In that way, you would also be able to demonstrate compliance to the supervisory authority. But of course, the more important thing is to make sure that everyone is culturally aware about data privacy. And apart from that, you can, like Reena mentioned, you can do snippets, you can do a series of different posts, maybe send them through emails and, simple 4 or 5 liners and not really complicated, but just tell people about the different data privacy practices your organization has. And if you have an intranet portal, make sure that it comes up on the news section, or maybe if you have a SharePoint, it comes up on the top right, top left, somewhere, something that is something a user would see when they log into their system, right? Or you can change the wallpaper of your corporate endpoint. You can also do that to make sure that users see that first thing when they log into their system. So these are some of the ways you can, kind of build those awareness activities, and you can make sure that privacy is something that is a part of your organization. So I think we have another question from Bhupendra, Reena. We'll just take that up. So the question is, how can the mindset of wait and watch be changed? In our experience, many companies are still in thinking mode to see how government implements the legislation.
Yeah, so it's actually always a push and pull thing, right? So if in your business, what is the priority? If you are dealing with personal data as part of your business, and that is the core activity which you are dealing with, it is required that you are driven by that. And then these aspects of personal data handling, privacy, framework creating, all of that will get driven. It cannot be a wait and watch. And if you see these current day IT services, all these business processes are baked with privacy. Okay, so it's all integrated, and it's a top-down approach which is adopted because that is actually a critical element in the business process delivery cycle. Okay, so unless personal data handling is not part of your core business, this will not get driven. And so it's a very easy answer here, that unless personal data is part of your day-to-day business operations, this will not get driven, and it's all top-down. So that is my answer on it.
Right. So I hope that answers your question as well, Bhupendra. If you have any follow-up questions you would like to ask, feel free to do it. Yeah, I think Bhupendra is good with that response, Reena. So Atul also wants us to share some thoughts on DPIA, the Data Protection Impact Assessment. So if you just like to speak a few words about it.
Yeah, so if you look at what is data protection impact assessment, that means we are trying to assess the impact of handling personal data in terms of either you have access to personal data, or you are processing, or you are storing, or you are deleting. Any of these aspects are covered through a impact assessment. Now, what all aspects from a collection standpoint? So what is your source of data? How is your method of collection? What data elements are you collecting? Then when you are collecting that data, how are you handling the data in terms of processing activity on that personal data? Then how are you storing that data? What is the data retention requirement from the regulatory standpoint or your business process as to how long that data has to be retained by you as a processor, right? All of these aspects are covered, and these are all mapped to the regulatory requirements by clauses in GDPR specifically. And then you can identify actions which are to be taken when you have done this assessment, because in order for meeting the mitigation requirements of this assessment, you will have to take certain actions. So for example, storage. the storage has to be there in terms of what is the central IT storage which you have for your personal data. Either you have a ERP system where there are storage mechanisms already built in by the package which you have implemented, or if there is unstructured data where there are Excel files or Word files or PDF files which are there generated as part of the processing. How are you planning to store them, and what is the access or the secure mechanism of that data which you're putting in place? So that aspect will come in. Now, from a retention and deletion perspective, what is the requirement from business? What is the regulatory requirement from what you are aligning with? Example, GDPR. Does it say that you have to retain the data for so many number of years after an employee has exited? So how are you implementing those data retention requirements? What are those mechanisms which you have put in place, whether you are going to actually physically delete the data or you will anonymize and keep it in a strict access control basis? These are all the aspects which are covered as part of the data protection impact assessment. Anything you want to add, Krishna?
I think, you covered everything beautifully. I mean, these are the certain topics we discuss about when we do a DPIA. Just wanted to add in that DPIA is something that can be done for a product, or it can be done for a process as well. If you have a particular business process that you want to kind of include as a part of your DPIA, you can do that. But you can also do it for a product that talks to different servers, has multiple or large scale architecture wherein data is flown between different microservices or different services. So that is also something you will have to consider. But given that you are doing a DPIA for a product, you will need some kind of technical backing to understand how the product works, because there would be different technological solutions or different IT solutions or systems that would be used. And for you to do a proper DPIA, you will have to understand each and every system that is being used to collect or process data. So there's some kind of technical expertise that I would recommend to have for a DPIA.
From conceptual standpoint, I think essentially to understand is that it is a risk mitigation activity which you are doing when you are actually assessing the risks from a standpoint where data is involved. So you consider the DPIA as a risk mitigation plan. That's it.
Right. So, Reena, there's also another question. I think someone wants to know if DPIA and PIA is the same thing.
Yeah. So PIA will cover other than data aspects as well, like a business process and so on. Data protection impact assessment specifically focuses on the impact of processing data in a nutshell. Yeah.
So I hope that answers your question. So we'll just move on to the next section. We were just discussing about data protection impact assessment. And I just want to also highlight the data loss prevention or the data leakage prevention. So if you look at DLP, loss and leakage are the two terms that are used everywhere across the globe. We are not sure which one came first. So I personally use whichever comes to me naturally. So data loss prevention is something that has been recently coming up as a solution to prevent data transfer to an external environment. And to do that, you implement an agent on your corporate endpoints. There are different types of data loss prevention methodologies. It could be an endpoint DLP, it could be an email DLP, it could be a network DLP. Right? There are different types of DLP solutions, and it has been one of the more recent solutions that have been coming up to prevent data loss from your infrastructure to any external infrastructure. Right? So data loss prevention is a pretty good practice that you can use to prevent sharing of any personal data to an external environment. It could be by a user, it could be by a system as well. If you have configured a system improperly, you could pose that system to send out data packets to any external environment as well. So it could be a configuration issue, it could be a user's issue, it covers everything, right? So data loss prevention is something that people should look for. Okay, I think we have a few more questions. Tapashankar has added a point wherein he says that PIA is a part of best practice, but DPIA is mandatory as per GDPR. So do you have a question here, Tapashankar, or is it just something you wanted to share with us as well? Or do you want to ask us something specific to this? Right, so I'll just wait for that response. Meanwhile, we can move on to the checklist for data protection. Right, so these are a few areas that you need to cover while you look for a data protection practice in your infrastructure, in your organization. Right, so you need to have a very clear privacy policy. So GDPR stresses a lot on making sure that the privacy statement or the privacy notice you have is as transparent as possible. You cannot use law terms or terms that are not understandable for users, right? Because in the end, it is meant for the user. And if they're not able to comprehend or understand the privacy policy, it defeats the purpose of having it. So you need to make sure that you have a very clear privacy policy. You destroy data that is of no use. You have a retention policy set up in your organization. It could be 3 years, 7 years, 10 years, but it also depends on the regulation, because in some certain regulations or in financial institutions, there might be a requirement where you have to store data for a period of 7 years. Right. So in that case, you have to make sure that you retain the data, but you also mention it to the user as well, that because of a legal interest or a legal basis, we are retaining your data for this specific time period. Also, right, like we just discussed about having a clear privacy policy, you also have to make sure that there is a transparency that is provided to users. And there should be an easy way to disable cookies as well, because cookie compliance is a huge challenge in larger organizations. Because I was just visiting a website probably yesterday or the day before, and I saw that there are 43 cookies in use. And the blanket statement that was put up by the website was that if you're using our website, you consent to the use of our cookies. So that was something that was like a news to me, because this website was also operating from the EU as well. They had operations largely in EU and that GDPR nations, and they were also operating in UK, Malaysia, US. So it's something that caught my eye. So any views on this, Reena?
Yeah, it is important actually to understand what is the expectation from a regulatory standpoint on cookie implementation, right? And based on the services which you are providing as per your website, what are those mandatory cookies which are supposed to be opted for? And then opt-in and opt-out is a very important concept, where the user should be given privilege to either click on that opt-in aspect of the cookies, or if they are opting out, they should be also they should also be communicated as to what features will not be available because they have not accepted the cookie policy, right? So that is how I think we need to take a view to.
So I agree with that. You have to understand what kind of regulations should you be looking for when you look at the cookie compliance, because in my experience, the e-privacy directive is something that offers a more comprehensive cookie practice program. So if you want to make sure that your cookies are compliant, then the EU privacy directive is something you should probably look at, the e-privacy directive, because it has more comprehensive details on how you can make sure that your cookie is compliant to the GDPR regulations and the general data privacy regulations. Right. So, Reena, we just had a simple Menti here again. We were discussing a lot about data breaches and responding to supervisory authorities. Right. So, we just have a simple question. What is the minimum time within which an organization should report a data breach to supervisory authorities? Of course, this is under GDPR. So just waiting for your opinions here. Just simply, guys, go to menti.com, type in your code and share your responses here. So, Reena, what's your take on this? Because I thought we had a pretty matured market
exactly.
related to data privacy, but then we see this kind of difference in the understanding.
Exactly. So 72 hours is the breach reporting timeline. And as a controller or as a controller of data, 72 hours is given by the GDPR.
Right. But if you feel that you need to do within 36 hours, that's well and good. Right. That's better than, of course, extending more than the 72 hours time limit. If you can do it in 36, that's well and good for you. But of course, the law, something that the law states is that you have to do it within 72 hours at the time that you have been informed of the data breach. Right.
Or maybe in a typical situation where, sorry, Krishna, in a typical situation where you have, as a controller, outsourced the processing activity to a processor, the data protection agreements can be agreed in terms of whether it should be a 24 hours or a 36 hours turnaround between the controller to processor. But the processor will not have direct responsibility to report a data breach to a supervisory authority. And hence, typically, these data protection agreements will call out 24 to 48 hours.
Agreed. So, right. So what we have on this deck is something that we have just discussed, because, of course, just like Reena mentioned, and just like the GDPR also states that you have to notify, the data controller has to notify the supervisory authority within 72 hours. And to have that, you need to have a data breach notification procedure. You need to understand who to contact and when to contact, and what details you need to share with the supervisory authority as well, if you are aware of a data breach. And IT teams play a critical role here, because they would be the first ones who would be aware of the different data breaches that might happen, along with the security team, of course. But to have an incident response plan or a data breach plan, the IT team would definitely make sure that the avenues for reporting those plans or reporting those incidents are there. Right? That would be the IT team's responsibility to make sure that there is a proper communication channel for users or for anyone in general to report a security breach within the organization. Right. So this brings us to the end of our presentation. So if you have any questions or any further activities that you would like us to know, then we would be happy to take it up. I think there's a question here from Kumar that what is the difference between PIA, LIA, and TIA, and how do we know when to perform those?
Yeah, so I think LIA is I don't know whether it's derived from the ICO website, legitimate interest assessment, right? That is LIA. TIA would be transfer impact assessment.
Yeah.
And PIA is privacy impact assessment, right? So if you are in a world where you are dealing with privacy and protection of data, all these three will be required to be taken care of, unless that at the organization level you are not processing personal data by legitimate interest. So if you're specifically processing personal data of individuals using legitimate interest as a lawful basis, LIA needs to be documented. Okay, and that is what is the guidance provided by ICO. Now, TIA would be a specific aspect when you are transferring data outside of your country to a third country, which is a non-GDPR nation, right? At that point in time, you'll have to evaluate the technical and security safeguards of that country where data is being transferred to, and there has to be standard contractual clauses, which is one of the ways in which this is established for secure processing of personal data outside of your country. PIA is again as a privacy impact assessment. That's a holistic concept, and DPIA forms a subset of PIA, right?
So I hope that answers your question as well, Kumar, because we have covered PIA in the previous few decks as well, right? And I think Tapashankar has a question, and he wants to know which team, IT or information security, is the first responder to a data breach. So I would just take up that question, Tapa, because personally, it depends on the organization size, right? Because if you have a dedicated information security team that is capable of responding to this breach, then it is the information security team that would ideally respond to it, or the security operations center, someone from the SOC team, right? And if there is personal data involved in that particular data breach, they need to talk to the data privacy team as well. Because in case there's a personal data that has been involved in the data breach, the privacy team has to, kind of notify the supervisory authority, and that is a mandate. So if you're missing out on those different segregations in the organization, that is something you have to look into. Because if there is any other kind of data breach, then there is no mandatory requirement for you to report it to supervisory authorities. But if it involves personal data, you have to take extra precaution when you deal with that data breach as well.
And it also depends what kind of contract you have with the controller, right? If you are a processor, then you have an obligation to directly report it to the controller. But if you're a controller, you have obligation to report in 72 hours from the time you know the incident. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So great. So I think we are just bang on time, Reena, as well. So if you have any other questions that you have, anything that you would like to know around data privacy, around cybersecurity, you can reach out to us. You have the LinkedIn profiles for Reena and myself in the chat section. Feel free to drop a connect or an invite to us. We are happy to connect with you, and we'll definitely try to respond to your questions as well. And then again, thank you so much, Reena, for coming here, for being a part of this webinar. Yeah. I think it was a pretty great experience to have you here, and hope we can communicate soon around some data privacy topics in the future as well.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion and educate the larger community on privacy. So I think these are good measures which Tsaaro is also doing, and we'll be happy to participate in future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you, Reena. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for coming in. I hope there were some insights you can take back to your organization as well and inculcate that privacy culture. So thank you for having us, and thank you so much for your time on a Thursday morning. Have a good day. Bye-bye.